developing and communicating the business continuity plan. I'd like to personally thank each of you for joining us today. My name is Bo Birch. I'll be your host and facilitator for today's segment. Please make note of the chat box feature. Should you have specific questions and comments that you'd like to share with our speaker today, send them through the chat portal. We're also sharing our speaker's email address, so you may reach out to him directly if you'd like. Our firm, Human Capital Solutions, has a dedicated email established, so you may forward any questions or suggestions about today's topic to workingremotely@humancs.com. Be sure to follow our LinkedIn page, Human Capital Solutions, Inc., for updates on our next Human Capital Matters segment scheduled for May the 7th. Some information about today's guest speaker. We're very thankful to have Stan Phelps with us. He's an accomplished author, a well-known TEDx speaker, a Forbes contributor, and certified speaking professional. Stan has presented at over 450 events and has spoken on every inhabited continent in over a dozen countries for Fortune 100 companies, such as IBM, Target, ESPN, UPS, GlaxoSmithKline, and Citi. Prior to focusing on writing and speaking, Stan held leadership positions at IMG, Adidas, and the PGA. He spent 7 years as Chief Solutions Officer at Synergy, an award-winning marketing agency. And at Synergy, he helped create larger-than-life brand experiences for brands such as KFC, M&M's, Walmart, and Starbucks. Today, Stan and I will have a conversation regarding the 5 specific ways to engage employees during a time of crisis. We are now several weeks into this crisis, the COVID crisis. The year 2020 will be a very memorable year for many of us. At the initial phase of this, boards and CEOs were scurrying to try to figure out, how do we keep our business open? How do we keep our customers taken care of? How do we keep supply chains open and channels? How do we engage employees that are now mainly working from home? So today we're glad to have you, Stan, as we explore ways beyond dollars and cents to drive employee engagement, such as transparency, team building, flexibility, recognition, and empowerment. During a crisis such as this, attendees should walk away with a knowledge of the key drivers of employee engagement. Hopefully we'll be able to introduce actionable ideas for our teams, the little things that will increase engagement and improve retention and reinforce the culture driving the results that our companies are seeking. Hopefully some key takeaways today would be adapting to change during a crisis, understanding how to develop programs that will address basics, belonging, and building, gaining a deeper appreciation for the needs, desires, and expectations of our key assets, human capital, our employees. Stan, welcome, my friend. Great to have you on our segment today.
Thank you, Bo. Thank you for having me in this uncertain times. Hopefully we're going to be able to shed a little bit of light in terms of how do we move forward in this crisis.
Yes, absolutely. I don't know if we're, what percentage of the way are we through this? We're not sure, but we still have cases and morbidity rates, and we're trying to figure out how do we move forward. So,
yeah, absolutely. So I think the first place to really start is we're talking about this topic of employee engagement, and it turns out that there's 75 different ways that we can drive employee engagement and reinforce culture. But I wanted to start today with, through the research that I've done and studies that I've seen, what is the number one driver? If we only had to focus on one thing, what would that be? And it turns out by far that the number one thing that folks should really focus on is to the extent to which this happens. It's to the extent to which employees believe that their management has a sincere interest in their well-being. So the sense that they know that the leaders of an organization care for them and that are holding their interests at heart. And so if we know that as an insight that that's what employees want, they want to know that their management is thinking about them, especially in times of crisis, we need to think about this. And this is the number one thing. How can we be as transparent as possible in communicating with our employees, knowing that there's a lot of uncertainty out there? Even in times of crisis, this is important, but you actually have to even go further. And the concept, I love this metaphor. It's called the Amsterdam window. In Amsterdam, these canal houses have these wide windows with no window shades on them at all. And the idea is that it's the idea of not only letting the sun in, but it forces you, when you keep the window of information open, it forces you to keep things clean. And so it's this idea that letting the sunlight in, putting things out in the open is the best way to move forward.
That's great. Very insightful, Stan. So you call these little things, Stan, green goldfish. Why green and why goldfish?
Yeah, I think it really depends on a lot of the small things that you do beyond, say, the compensation that you pay. The little things that you do to show your employees warmth and competence. And this idea of little things, meaning that a little bit of my background, you shared a little bit of my background in marketing. My first book was all about the customer bow. And everything, I studied over 1,000 examples from hundreds of companies. And it was amazing to me that when I looked across all of these different companies, the ones that really got it for the customer even got it more so for their own employees. Like they put a greater emphasis on employees first and then customers second. And so the big realization was that these companies realized that you can't have happy, enthused customers unless you have happy, engaged employees. And so investing in doing the little things, not only for your customers, but more so for your employees, is absolutely paramount. And studies show that Gallup's done a lot of work on engagement, that companies that have deeply engaged employees, they grow 3 times as fast as their competition. They obviously, people are happy to be coming to work. They suffer less turnover, performance spikes and increases. So similar to the purple goldfish, where I looked at 1,000 examples for customers, I did the green goldfish, which was all about finding the little ways that you could drive engagement and reinforce culture. And it became very apparent when you looked across hundreds of examples of a lot of the little things that you can do. So green is a metaphor for really going beyond the dollars that you pay. How do you do the little things? The goldfish piece is really, the goldfish is a metaphor for growth and differentiation. So how do you do the little things to stand out in what I would call a sea of sameness in the marketplace?
Excellent, Stan. What would you say, Stan, are a couple of the basic building blocks that we need to really get right during this crisis?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We studied in the 1,000+ examples, found that there's essentially 15 main ways that you can drive engagement. And not all of them are set up the same. They almost go into what we call a pyramid shape, where if you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you have some lower level, what we call basic building blocks that you need to figure out and get right. So I think as we look in this time of crisis, we'll talk a little bit about shelter and wellness. And shelter being more, think about that as more of the physical space that your employees inhabit. And ideally, the space that you have for them helps reinforce the culture as opposed to dictating it. And we're in a situation now where a lot of people, for the first time, their workspace is actually in their home space, and they're dealing with working from home. And so as an employer, to help them stay engaged, how can you give them the technology platforms that they can communicate? How do you give them the equipment, whether it's bigger monitors, whether it's thinking about how they set up their workspace to allow them to be more productive, and also starting to think about what's going to happen when they come back to the workplace. How will you need to change things within your office environment or physical workspace to accommodate this new normal of COVID-19? So it could be that in your conference rooms, you always make sure that there's an empty chair if you have a meeting between people to maintain that safe social distance. The second piece is about wellness. And this is so important. You can't have a happy employee unless they're healthy, right? And so there's a lot of things that I think we need to get right during this crisis, whether it's being able to offer resources like telemedicine. So if somebody feels like they have a condition, they have an outlet that they can reach out, not feel like they have to come into the office if they're not feeling up to it. Be able to provide them resources within the workplace when they come back, whether that's hand sanitizer, masks, be able to give them the tools that they need to be safe in that safe and well in that working environment. So that safeness, that space piece and the wellness piece, I think, are critical building blocks to make sure that people feel safe working from home and then when they ultimately come back into the workplace.
Excellent insight, Stan, and how powerful shelter and wellness are right now, particularly. It's at our forefront. So how do we create this greater sense of belonging? We've got the distancing going. People aren't coming to the workplace. We don't see each other walking down the hallway by the water fountain. How do we create or maybe recreate this sense of belonging?
Yeah, belonging is an absolute key element. And we talk about this idea that once you get those basic things, those basic needs met, you can then level up to greater kind of functions and levels of need. And that middle level is what we call creating a sense of belonging. And so there's a couple of things there that I want to touch on. The first is flexibility, and the second is team building. And we'll talk about flexibility first. Now, I think that as we're working from home, and we might even have to stagger the times that people work within an office environment, I think this idea of flexibility is going to become greater and greater as we move forward. We're now understanding that work is no longer a physical place that you go. Work is merely something that you do. And so this is Best Buy a number of years ago. The team there at the corporate headquarters pioneered what they call a ROW. And ROW is a results-only work environment, meaning that we're not tracking time per se, we're just tracking the overall results and giving people the flexibility they need to complete their job in a manner that they see fit. And so I think as we go forward, especially for the younger generations, this has now become an expectation that they're going to have that flexibility and a reason why they may join a certain employer. And here's the thing, this is one of my favorite examples out of the 1,000 or so that we collected. This is a 2-person PR firm in New York City. And the one employee at the time was, her fiance was a New York City police officer. And when you're a police officer, you work 5 days on, 3 days off, 5 days on, 2 days off. So you can imagine that your work schedule gets kind of messed up over the course of time. It's nowhere near a Monday through Friday. Well, the owner of this company said to their lone employee, whenever your fiance is working, you work. Whenever your fiance is off, you're off. And if you can do flexibility in a 2-person organization, there's no excuse that others can't emulate that. Bo, you touched on this thing that team building is such an important thing. And now we're apart. We still have this need to feel like we're coming together as a team. And so I think it's going to be important of how can we come up with ways to, bring back that virtual water cooler of sorts? How do we replace some of those hallway conversations where we feel like we connect with the other team members? And so I've seen companies in this crisis, create virtual happy hours. I've seen, everyone brings almost like a potluck, eats together during lunch. We've got to find ways that we're not just in the meetings that we have, online meetings, but ways we can just bring people together so they feel like they can chat and catch up. I think that's absolutely key. I think the same thing as we go back into the post-COVID-19 workplace, we're going to need to find ways to reunite as well.
Excellent, Stan. So how important do you think it is to empower our team members during this time? And there's a lot of concern that folks are working from home and they're working unsupervised. So may we empower people that are working unsupervised that may not have a track record of working unsupervised?
Right. I think we have to, in this time, I think we need to go out of our way to try to give people greater control and have them not only be empowered to be able to set their schedule and be flexible in terms of how they do their work. I think we need to find opportunities as we're all working differently to empower our team members. And empower, by the way, sits right at the top of this triangle. It's kind of the self-actualization where I feel totally empowered. I feel like I'm contributing, I'm valued. This is right at the pinnacle of creating a sense where people can feel like they can become a greater sense of themselves, a greater version of themselves, that their work allows them to be an extension. They really feel the purpose of what they do aligns with them. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to give our employees opportunities to take control of things. We're now trying to figure out things in a much different way than we were a month or 6 weeks ago. And there's a lot of workarounds that are being created right now, better processes that are being created, and we're being forced to be a lot more innovative than we've had in the past. And so I think it's important that companies recognize that we're capturing those things that we're doing, those innovative things, to hopefully that they can continue on, once we go back into a more quote unquote normal work environment. And so a great example of this comes from 3M. And 3M, in their first few decades as an organization, were in the red. They weren't a profitable company. But coming out of World War II, 3M decided to make a little bit of a shift and to actually give their engineers what they called 15% time, meaning that every engineer had the ability for 15% of their workday to work on a personal project that they thought was relevant to the organization. And that's where innovations like the Post-it note, them using a type of glue that failed other purposes, was repurposed into the Post-it note. Google has even one-upped this. They've created what's called 20% time, where they give their team members that time to be able to own a project and feel like they're really have an outlet for their creativity. So, there's a great saying, never let a crisis go to waste. I think part of that is, again, we're forced to now do things differently. There's a lot of good that's going to come out of this. Let's not miss those workarounds, those better ways of doing things once we were in this situation that we were in.
That's very helpful for us. The first few weeks, our board folks and C-level people were telling us they just feel like their hair's on fire, trying to find their business continuity plan, trying to find their bearings. Things were dropping so quickly. We're in a containment mode. And, the last week or two, we're hearing more from C-suite folks that they are tending to have more time in strategy now. And there's a lot of quiet time and time in solitude, as you've mentioned, to invest in how we come out of this stronger. So with this in mind, Stan, where should we start? Is there a place to start that you could advise us on?
Yeah, I always say start small and start now. So I would concentrate, at least in the beginning, to make sure that you're doing that assessment around the space and the wellness, to make sure that you're providing for those basic needs. But then I would challenge you when it comes to things like belonging or empowerment, is how do you think about this not as what I would call a Trojan horse of sorts, right? Think about this idea of a green goldfish more like what I would call a Trojan goldfish. Little things that you roll out and try and see if they stick. And so don't think, especially in this times where we have to move a little quicker, that it needs to be 100% perfect before it launches. Right? Take a more agile approach to doing some of these things. Get that minimal viable idea out there and know that you're going to iterate a 1.0, a 2.0 of it. And don't be afraid to do a bunch of different things to address these issues. One of the things that I've heard, Bo, that you just touched on, is that some people are finding now that they're working remotely, that what took them 8 or 9 hours to do in an office environment, they're now getting done in like 2.5 or 3 hours. And that's pretty amazing to think about. How do we take advantage of some of that other time, if we're being maybe a little more efficient in some areas of our roles, to be able to do some other things? Potentially maybe taking on some of those online courses or training that we've put off, right? How do we provide them, just provide our employees with opportunities to do more creative and more fun things that they can schedule into their day to keep them sane during these times. So again, start small, start now, take an agile approach.
Wise words, Stan. As we move into our questions and comments, Human Capital Matters has been at this for several weeks now, and we're seeing perhaps an evolution of and a theme, not only questions, concerns, and answers, but now comments about what is working, perhaps best-in-class practices, some breakthroughs, epiphanies companies are experiencing through being more innovative and having some time at this, right? So Let's look at some questions. Stan, I'll let you grab those as they're coming through the chat
Sure.
portal.
Yeah, and I tell people it's not question and answers, it's questions and comments. So feel free in the chat. You can either send it to me privately or you can send it to everyone. But I'll try to address some of the things. So we have a question that came in from Chris. How important is recognition during a crisis? And that's a fantastic question, because I think it's absolutely important. I think it's more important during a crisis than when it is in just normal working conditions. Again, the fact that a lot of us are apart, the ability to recognize the efforts of your team members is key. And one of the things that we talk about in the Green Goldfish book is that oftentimes we look at recognition as something that is an after the fact thing that we do. If X happens, then we recognize it with Y. And I think the big takeaway is recognition can actually fuel performance at every different stage. So as leaders, I think it's important for us to recognize the little things and do it early and often, because used correctly, recognition can actually fuel performance and actually reinforce the outcomes that we want. And so I think recognition, you can't do it too often, you can't do it too soon. And many times there's a big disconnect from what leaders believe that they're giving and what employees know that they receive. There's a gap there. So we almost as leaders have to over recognize to accommodate for that. Second question here, how do we effectively utilize the extra time our employees might have during a crisis? And that's a great question. I touched on it a little bit earlier. You might have employees that are extremely efficient now. And there may have been projects that in the past that have been one of those projects like, hey, we're ultimately going to get around to it, but you never do because we're busy in the midst of things. It may be an opportunity to readdress some of those things in the past that were back burner type of stuff. How do we bring them back? How do we assign them to different people to allow them to have that ownership? I touched on training again. There's a ton of great online training out there that people can do at their own pace. So why not give people an opportunity while they may have some downtime to upskill and learn new things, learn new skills that they can bring back. So, and I think also, I think we have to acknowledge that we need to schedule in time for us to have kind of sanity, to maybe do things like meditation and focus on ourselves, whether it's getting out and exercising or just scheduling time to have a little bit of a creative break. We need to focus, we need to actually schedule those things in. From David, genuine concern for employees' well-being seems like a pretty basic human principle. Why do some companies thrive and some companies struggle with demonstrating this concern, both in times of crisis and non-crisis? I agree that I think it should be a pretty basic thing. I think for too many companies, though, the focus is either too much on the customer themselves to the detriment of the employees, or there's too much focus on the shareholder and driving profit without the realization that both the customer being happy and profits being a result are intricately tied to employee engagement. And so to me, smart companies put employees first, customers second, and then ultimately shareholders third. And they have the right focus. And I would say even further that great companies may even put the purpose of the company at the forefront, with employees being that next rung or number two on the, and as long as you're, I think, focusing on the purpose, understanding the importance of your employees, you're ultimately going to have the happy customers and the great results. So I think this is going to be a reset point, David, that as we come out of this crisis, people are going to have to really think about, and the things that they did during the crisis for their employees is going to echo for not months, but years, and maybe in some cases decades of how we handled it during this time. So I think it's absolutely key. Bo, any questions for you or other thoughts you want to add?
Well, yeah, I think you're really something. I really like these questions that have come in, and David, you really hit a nerve with me and my career. I've been at this about 30 years now. My first opportunity out of undergrad at James Madison was a second shift HR manager that evolved into a second shift plant foreman. And I didn't know much about how to be a plant foreman. But what I did know that the folks out there on the floor, the operators, they knew what they were doing. And I would make a point to walk around pre-shift and say, what do you need from me this shift to be effective? How may I help you be successful? And it was a naive position that I had, but I found out that that really worked. The second shift actually became a top producer over first shift just because of servant leadership. And I think that's basically what you said without saying it, is today the leaders that are serving folks saying, what do you need out there? I know you're at home. Are you okay? Are you well? And what may we provide you and your family to get through this challenging time, right? So if you're that way in normal times, it's easier to be that way in times of crisis. Would you agree, Stan?
I absolutely, one of my favorite quotes comes from Mike Tyson, right? Everyone has a plan or a strategy, right? Until they get punched in the face.
Yeah.
And so I think how we handle things, how we can demonstrate both warmth, right? The genuine concern, that some of the intention that we have, and then how do we do it in a way that exudes competence, that gets people to really feel like things are in control. It turns out 80% of how we view other people comes down to just those two factors, warmth and competence. So how do we show that we have that sincere interest? How do we stay the course and show that we can be competent? If you can just do those two things, by little things that you show, it's going to go a long way.
Absolutely. Great, great work. And I hope, and I'm confident there's been a lot of folks out here today that are encouraged by this. And maybe you're a leader and you have a lot of people reporting in, and this is a very different time and challenging time as a leader. Maybe you're an employee without direct reports and finding that this has been a very, very challenging time. So I think there's some nuggets here, some takeaways, Stan, that we all may be able to utilize.
Great.
Yeah.
No, really thank you for allowing me to be part of this. I think we're all, learning kind of on the fly of what to do in this time of crisis. But I think a friend of mine said you can never be nervous when you're of service.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's about trying to find ways to be of service and to be that servant leader in this time of crisis.
Absolutely. Excellent. Thank you again, Stan, and we wish you the very best. You have some things coming out that you may want to put us on notice about. What you would be looking for next from you?
Yeah, thank you. I've got the 10th color in the series. This one that we talked about today is all about the employee In fact, Lauren McGee, who's part of Human Capital Solutions, teamed up with me on the 2.0 edition of Green Goldfish. But the 10th color, it's actually a metal, the 10th in the series is coming out on May 5th. It's called the Silver Goldfish. And it's all about communication and being able to deliver memorable business presentations. And it's strategically coming out on May 5th because that's 5-5. And the entire concept is around this military idea of coming across 5 by 5, which is military speak for loud and clear. So coming out on 5-5, keep your eyes out for it, the Silver Goldfish.
Absolutely. We certainly will, Stan. We thank you again for carving out your time in your busy schedule to be with us. And so
Appreciate
just to let folks know, this is Stan Phelps. This is his email address. Email him and send your comments over. Encourage him and build a relationship with Stan. He's a leader that is definitely earns respect. Our website, our email address at Human Capital Solutions for this work at Human Capital Matters is working remotely at humancs.com. If we may be of support, if we may be an advocate, if there's an area going on with you and your business, we would be happy to talk about that. So, our next event is scheduled May the 7th for Human Capital Matters. What we are seeking to do, our purpose is to bring people with a particular skill set of knowledge, like Stan and the other speakers, to the audience to help us better navigate this time of crisis, particularly, which is about the business continuity plan and execution. Business continuity plan and execution. Today, I really think it helps us a lot with how to more effectively execute the business continuity plan. So, anything in closing, Stan?
No, again, thank you for having me out. I hope it maybe sparked an idea or two for people watching this, and thanks again for having me.
You've been a real treat. It's been great to get to know you and work together. Thank you.